Good morning and welcome everyone to our Documenting COVID-19 in Australia Symposium today at the National Archives of Australia. My name is Roslyn Russell and I'm Chair of the UNESCO Australian and Member of the World Committee. It's my great pleasure now to welcome Paul House, the custodian of Ngambri and Ngunnawal lands in which we are meeting here today. Thank you, Paul.
Awurugawuri, thank you, and Jumburuburu Marambang, good morning, Marinya everyone, Baladu Yaba, Ngambri, Wogalu, Wiradjuri Niyang, I'm speaking Ngambri, Wogalu, Wiradjuri language, Yilingalangbu, Gibabunga Wogabu, Migabu, Diranilbang, Mayin Marinya. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Dr. Roslyn Russell, Nyari Njamali, Ngambri, Gamal, Wogalu, Wallablaw, Ngunnawal, Mujigang, Yanangbu, Jayandu. My respects to Ngambri, Gamal, Wogalu, Wallablaw, Ngunnawal, elders past and present. Nyari Njamarabu, Mujigango, Nurumbanjigu, Ninya Yiradu. My respects to all people, all elders from all parts of the country. Ngambri, Ngunnawal, Wallablaw, Marinya, Gaimbanya, Ninyogar, Nurumbango Dara, Ngambri, Ngunnawal people, welcome you all to country. This welcome to country is made in the spirit of peace and a desire for harmony for all peoples of the modern ACT and surrounds. And our main aim as local custodians is to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre and post contact of the region. Yinjamara, Yinjamalgiri, Yinjamarabu. Respect, respectful, respected. Yinjamara, Magagiri, Biringa, Bogongu, Dirinda. Respect can be found in the journey of the Bogong moths in the mountains. Yinjamara respect. Yinjamalgiri, Palawalmanga Dabu, Mudan Madan Dabu, Banmayu Gurungambira. Respect can be found in the grinding stones and the carved trees made long ago on country. Yinjamara, Balabidada, Binabida, Wurrawin, Nyamba Ngunnawal. Respect can be found in the rivers quietly moving through country. Mijambalda, Paul House Girawa. My name is Paul House Girawa. I'm a custodian of country sites of the Canberra region. Our people who through law and custom hold cultural knowledge and continue to maintain connection in a contemporary modern society. The law of the land talks about giving respect and honour to all people in all parts of the country. Our signature is in the land, not just our DNA, and taking care of country is important to us all. The more we respect country, the more we look after country, the more country looks after us. Muran Maginya Yinjamara Muran Mura Wiran Biradara. A respectful way of life cares for country. Yinjamara Wiran Bida, Marando Gobu, Giira Gobu, Yando Gobu. Respect is taking responsibility for the now, the past, the present, and the future. We believe it's important that places like the National Archives, Muralangalang, house and preserve the stories of our people. And it's important that we protect these places and landscapes for the long-term survival of our stories on country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I like to say, Yinjamara, Maramara, Nya Nyinya Girama, respect shapes us and lifts up the people. On behalf of our elders, our matriarchs and patriarchs, I'd like to say, Gurubari, welcome, and Wurugawuri, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and we'll take those words with us through today as we remember the lands on which we are meeting today. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to welcome everyone formally on behalf of the Australian Member of the World Committee and, of course, National Archives of Australia, and especially to thank the team at National Archives, the Director General, David Fricker, and his team here for setting up the symposium today. It has been an enormous task, but I'm sure we're going to have a very, very productive day indeed. So thank you very much. This is an important time for us as a committee. 2 years ago, this month, we had a summit in Canberra Museum and Gallery on documenting Australian society. And this is the first occasion since that time when we've had a chance to publicly examine one particular aspect of documenting Australian society, and the one that is engaging us very much these days, the COVID-19 epidemic and our response to it. We've chosen to go down this pathway, and Adrian will explain more in more detail how we'll do this, because it's a way of looking at one particular segment of documentary heritage in this country for now. We have bigger plans for looking at larger sections, but this time we're focusing on a current crisis and its documentation and how we preserve its memory into the future. 20 years ago, also in this building, we started our meetings of the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. So it's a great anniversary for us as a committee, and also a marker of the collaboration between the National Archives of Australia and the Australian Memory of the World Committee. Other project partners for us in this endeavour have been the National Library of Australia and the National Archives of Australia and the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and many, many others. So on behalf of the many members of the committee that have served us past and present, some are here today, some survivors of the first committee, including myself and including Adrian Cunningham, and several others. I would like to thank everybody who's been a supporter of the Memory of the World program through these 20 years. In that time, we've built our register to 69 entries of significant documentary heritage in Australia. We're about to add a number of other items to the register. But today we're focusing on a bigger goal of the Memory of the World program, which is to identify, preserve and provide access to documentary heritage. Our program is not just about putting things on registers, it's about preserving and making documentary heritage accessible. And we are pioneering in many ways as a national committee this primary goal of the Memory of the World program. So we are celebrating again today our 20th anniversary, and I'd like to thank, in absentia, but thank our inaugural chair, Dr. Jan Lyle, who was the person who initiated the program. We owe a great deal to Jan, and her legacy continues into the present. And today's event is a very tangible reminder of what Jan achieved and the previous committees have achieved to get us to this place. Thank you everyone for your support, particularly our institutional members who have been stalwart all the way through. And I'd like to thank particularly Mr. David Fricker, the National Archives Director General and Vice President of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee. David is part of the governing body of the program, to speak to us today. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ros. You are allowed to applaud. It's a virtual symposium, but you are, you know. Look, thank you very much, Ros, and thanks also to Paul Howes for that welcome to country. And can I also say, in the spirit of reconciliation, Naji and Jamali, Ngambri, Ngunnawal, Walgalu, Wallabaloa, Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri, Majigang Yanibu and Jandu. Our respects to elders past and present of the Ngambri Ngunnawal First Nations upon which we meet today. Dira Nalbang Maranja, Gurabari, Ninyalga, Muralangalang, distinguished guest, welcome you all today to the National Archives of Australia. One thing that, just following on from Ros's opening remarks and thinking back to that Documenting Australia Society, which is a fantastic initiative of the Memory of the World Committee, and where we are today going through Australia's experience and what is an international experience with this pandemic. A recurring theme that has come up amongst memory institutions is it's very common, almost every politician, every public commentator talking about the pandemic keeps on talking about these unprecedented times that we're living through. And many of us in the memory business keep saying, well, is it unprecedented, really? You know, it's in our living memory, it perhaps is unprecedented, but is this the first time humanity has faced a pandemic? And, you know, why aren't we just reaching to those memories of previous pandemics? I mean, going back to, you know, the bubonic plague, going back to the Spanish flu. You know, and Australia's experience of the Spanish flu is almost forgotten. You know, we remember almost every bullet fired of the First World War. You know, we have exhaustive histories of the battlefields and the tremendous losses and events of the First World War, and yet we remember almost nothing about the Spanish flu, which is, you know, almost at the same time. And even with previous, you know, with later pandemics around HIV/AIDS, with SARS, with bird flu, you know, these sorts of things come and go, and we treat them as a bit of a health blip, but we don't seem to be learning very much as a nation. Well, not this time. So in cooperation with the Memory of the World, and as part of that Documenting Australian Society initiative, all of us across the Commonwealth and the state and territory jurisdictions in memory institutions have really resolved this time around that actually we are going to remember. You know, we are not going to forget the experience, the national experience of COVID. We have resolved that we are going to remember it, and we're going to gather the evidence that we can to make sure that over the longer period, once we're through this, on the other side, as we keep saying, we can then look back at what we've been through and make sense of it all, and Australia, hopefully, will become a more resilient country. The world will become a more resilient place. Our international global economy might become more resilient and deal with these shocks, such as pandemics, in a much more prepared and coordinated way in the future. As Ros just mentioned, I am the Vice Chair, one of the Vice Chairs of the International Advisory Committee of the Memory of the World program, and I'm very pleased to say that our symposium today is part of an international effort, and we'll be hearing from Fackson Banda, the head of the Documentary Heritage Unit at UNESCO shortly. But Australia has been a very, very active contributor to the international response, especially in terms of documentary heritage. We have been a signatory to UNESCO statements on the importance of documentation. Does not diminish during a pandemic, it increases, and part of an international movement to make sure that the documentary heritage of the world is preserved as a future resource for science, for health, and for societal resilience. And I think this is really good. And again, congratulations both to you, Ros, and to you, Adrian, on you bringing forward this day today in partnership with the National Archives to contribute to that international effort. I really do think it's very, very important. And here I'd also make reference to the UNESCO's 2015 recommendation on preservation and access to documentary heritage, a very important recommendation from UNESCO on documentary heritage, and it calls for collaboration just like we are doing today, and it calls on government institutions like the National Archives of Australia and the others represented here today to actually do something constructive and collaborative around documentary heritage. So it's a very important event, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. And here, the genesis of today was, of course, flowing on from the Documenting Australian Society initiative of the Australian Memory of the World Committee, but it was also over a roundtable gathering that was hosted by AU Cloud, our sponsor today, and Phil Dawson, who's in the room with us today, Phil. And you know, we were talking about, well, what are we going to do in a collaborative sense? What can we actually do in a tangible way to get around this initiative and make something tangible out of it? And Phil, thank you to AU Cloud for getting on board with this and for sponsoring today's event. Your assistance and cooperation is really appreciated. And for those of you that don't know Phil, I mean, beyond AU Cloud, Phil, you know, personally, you've had a very long association and dedication to cultural heritage and making sure that, given that most of documentary heritage today is digital, most of the stuff we're creating is digital documentary heritage, and there can be no better partner than an organisation like AU Cloud to actually take some responsibility for the preservation of digital heritage into the future. So really appreciate your involvement today, and we are very, very grateful. Look, as I said at the outset, you know, we're in the middle of this pandemic at the moment, and when you're in the middle of a crisis, of an emergency, it's very difficult to see it all for what it is and understand the full context. It takes some years of looking back and really understanding what it is we've been through. But you can't look back and understand it unless we are collecting the evidence right now. So our job today, I think, really is to make sure we are acting in a constructive and collaborative way to make sure we are keeping all the evidence of our experience today, so that in the years to come, we can then look back and, as I say, make sense of it all with the ambition of making Australia a much more resilient nation, better able to deal with the next pandemic, because one thing we can be sure of, there will be more pandemics. So look, on that note, I shall leave it there. Thank you once again, Ros, for this event today. Also, I just echo your comments, Ros. Thank you to my team. If you can indulge me for a moment, my team at the National Archives have done a great job as well in pulling this together. So with that, Ros, I'll say thank you and hand back to you. Thank you all.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your kind words as well. And I also would like to endorse the thanks to the sponsor that has been so generously part of this program. Now I'd like to introduce virtually Dr. Fackson Banda. Fackson Banda is the Chief of the Documentary Heritage Unit at UNESCO that manages the Memory of the World program. He has served at UNESCO for almost 10 years, working on media literacy, journalism, education and media development. And I'll hand over to Fackson's pre-recorded address. Thank you.
Let me start by thanking the National Archives of Australia and the Memory of the World Committee for the invitation to take part in this seminar on documenting COVID-19 in Australia. By way of introduction, let me underline the fact that pandemics have occurred at various points in time. The plague of Athens in 430 BC, the 14th century bubonic plague, which traveled along the Silky Road and reached the Mediterranean, the 19th century outbreak of cholera, the 1918 Spanish flu, whose death toll stood at more than 50 million people worldwide, and the smallpox pandemic, which was eradicated in 1980. Common to all these global health crises is the fact that they are a matter of record or documentation, handed down through generations as documentary heritage of significant and enduring value to a community, a culture, a country, or to humanity generally. Documentary heritage is thus a key feature of any knowledge society. The UNESCO World Report, entitled Towards Knowledge Societies, argues that every society has its own knowledge assets. Such knowledge assets enable societies to 1. Nurture their diversity and capacities, 2. Foster knowledge sharing, and 3. Enhance the diffusion of information and communication technologies to create new opportunities for development. Taking into account these 3 characteristics of knowledge societies, I argue that there is evidence to suggest that documentary heritage is providing an invaluable knowledge asset for COVID-19 decision-making in 3 specific areas. 1. Influencing behavior. 2. Instigating national policy responses or institutional initiatives. And 3. Providing an opportunity to harness technological innovation. First, in terms of influencing behavior, documentary heritage is acting as a source of scientific, educational, aesthetic, and cultural knowledge sharing among citizens, memory institutions, and governments. Knowledge sharing helps with lessons learned from both negative and positive actions taken in response to such pandemics across time and space. The 1918 Spanish flu offers a window into how individuals, communities, and governments dealt with its impact. Thus, in response to COVID-19, we are beginning to see scientists and historians studying the 1918 outbreak for clues to the most effective way to stop a global pandemic, and that can only be done through the documents that have been handed down to us. In fact, Public Health England started the Spanish flu outbreak to draw up its own contingency plan for COVID-19. The key lesson was that the second wave of the disease proved to be far more deadly than the first. As governments ease their lockdown measures, such knowledge sharing may prove instructive in influencing patterns of behavior. Second, documentary heritage provides an empirical knowledge asset to guide national policy responses and/or institutional initiatives for information preservation and accessibility. The knowledge content in such documentary heritage may include how societies nurtured their diversity and capacity to address a global health pandemic in a systematic and sustained manner. Thus, equipped with such past knowledge and in response to COVID-19, several policy responses are observable. For example, the National Archives Administration of China issued a notification requiring archival departments to, among other things, provide the government and health departments with historical pandemic documents. In Japan, the ministry in charge of public records and archive management demanded that all documents related to the virus created by government agencies be stored and transferred to the National Archives of Japan. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Museum began documenting the pandemic by curating coronavirus-related artifacts, including from the public. The UK's Swansea University has deployed a mass observation study to document everyday lives during the COVID-19 pandemic, such as diary entries, including written accounts, video diaries, or even social media posts. Third, COVID-19 opens opportunities to think more critically about how technological innovation can be harnessed to reproduce documentary heritage into new forms of knowledge. A first step could be enhanced digitization of historical records, which can enable more effective and widespread knowledge use and reuse, especially across libraries, archives, and museums. This would then ensure a wider access on electronic networks to their digitized and born digital documents. This would require implementing some kind of interoperability protocol to their different systems to facilitate access to their digitized collections for the end users, along with creating a common digitized content in the form of images, texts, and sounds. Here too, artificial intelligence could be harnessed, including by applying its deep learning capabilities to transcribe millions of scanned images of historical documents into machine-readable versions of historical texts. This would enable documents from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds to find their way into the public domain. AI could also assist in auto-analyzing historical texts in a way that can throw up patterns of human behaviors and interactions during a historical time period. Assessed by human intelligence and contextualized by human experience, such AI auto-analysis can prove a helpful device in understanding and responding to COVID-19, considering past human behaviors and interactions around similar pandemics. To conclude my remarks, let me reiterate the fact that documentary heritage is indeed a unique knowledge asset. Its utility value as such is becoming increasingly evident in how societies are making decisions in response to COVID-19 at the behavioral, policy, and technological levels. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks go to Fackson Banda for his eloquent and comprehensive global perspective with an historical dimension on documentary heritage and its use in managing pandemics. I think that was a very interesting and certainly very thoughtful contribution, and I'll be thanking Fackson personally myself for his contribution to our symposium today. I'd now like to introduce Adrian Cunningham, who's had 40 years' experience working with documentary heritage at national and state libraries and archives, and currently is an independent consultant. Adrian is also a foundation member of the Australian Memory of the World Committee, and he has done the lion's share of the work from our perspective, from our Member of the World Committee's point of view, in organising this symposium, for which I thank him most sincerely and welcome him to the lectern. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks very much, Ros, and thank you to David and the National Archives team for making this event possible today. It's great to be here, and it's great to keep the Documenting Australian Society initiative alive and visible and moving forwards. So, I won't be talking much at all about COVID-19 in my little talk this morning. What I'll be doing is talking about the broader initiative of which documenting COVID-19 is an example or a case study, if you like. And so I'd like all of the participants today to understand the broader initiative, how it fits in with the work of UNESCO, and you've already heard a little bit about that, recent work in the context of that initiative and some of our future plans. So, as Ros has said, it's pretty much almost exactly 2 years to the day since we held the summit meeting in Canberra on Documenting Australian Society. Now, that was an invitation-only event. Its aim was to test the appetite of key players for pursuing a more coordinated approach to building a distributed Australian documentary heritage estate, an estate that is as representative as possible of the full diversity and complexity of Australian life. As one of the organisers of that summit, I was quite prepared for the possibility that the answer to the question might be, no thanks, we're not that interested. Or perhaps, nice idea, but it's totally unrealistic and we've got better things to do with our limited resources. And if so, I would have walked away telling myself, well, we had to try, but at least now we know that the idea won't fly. But that didn't happen. In fact, the summit delegates endorsed the idea and passed an 11-point Canberra declaration, committing themselves and or their organisations to work collaboratively to pursue a representative national estate of documentary heritage. I don't have time to go through the entire declaration today, but you can read it at your leisure on the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World website, or just Google Canberra Declaration and UNESCO and you'll find it. But please don't confuse it with another Canberra Declaration issued around the same time by an anti-abortion group. We got there first, though. The first 5 points of the declaration are all pretty much motherhood statements. They summarise the issue and explain why it matters. The remaining 6 points are all action items, and my main purpose this morning is to describe what has transpired over the 2 years since then in terms of pursuing those action items and to paint a picture of where we think we'll go in the next year or two. Today's webinar focusing on the need to ensure preservation of and access to important documentation of the current pandemic, in addition to drawing attention to the initiative, is an example of the kinds of collaboration, advocacy, big picture thinking and discussion that's part and parcel of the initiative. So, aims of the initiative. The aim is to achieve better planning and coordination of distributed efforts to preserve and provide access to a representative corpus of documentary heritage materials to help current and future generations understand, debate and interrogate the nature of human experiences in Australia. In an environment of low and possibly shrinking overall funding for documentary heritage programs, it is more important than ever for practitioners nationwide to be seen to be working together to ensure that we spend our limited budgets in ways that help deliver the best possible collective outcomes for preserving and providing access to the documentary heritage estate of the nation, one that documents Australian society in all of its wonderful complexity and diversity. Collectively, there's a need to develop and operationalise frameworks and mechanisms that can help guide the making of hard choices and agreeing and allocating responsibilities. These frameworks and mechanisms need to be evidence-based, defensible, coherent, realistic, inclusive, holistic, contestable, transparent and capable of evolving. But one of the key points that everyone needs to understand is we can't preserve everything. The taxpayers won't fund the preservation of every single document that's ever created. As a former boss of mine here at the National Archives used to say, how many children will live in poverty as a result of the decision to spend money on preserving things? We have to make hard choices. We can't keep everything, and those hard choices have to be defensible, transparent, and made with reference to some kind of evidence base. So we also need to do this work with a good understanding of the current state of Australian documentary heritage holdings, its strengths, weaknesses, gaps and overlaps, our baseline, if you like. More importantly and far more challengingly, it needs to be informed by knowledge of and some level of agreement on what's important and distinctive about the diversity and complexity of life in Australia that has to be reflected in our documentary heritage to help current and future generations of Australians understand and interrogate our experiences. Our responsibility is to ensure that important aspects of Australian life are not neglected as a result of well-meaning but disjointed, fragmented and ad hoc efforts pursued in the absence of a holistic regime that provides support and resources to diverse, community-driven documentary preservation programs. So the objectives of the initiative are ambitious, if not audacious. It will not be easy to achieve success, but if something is important, the fact that it may be difficult is no reason not to attempt to make some progress on the issue, and that we would stand to be condemned if we don't even try our best to achieve success. Gallant failure is preferable to a lack of action, or indeed a lack of acknowledgement of the importance of the issue. So why UNESCO? We've heard a little bit about that, but I believe that this initiative is fully consistent with the objectives of the UNESCO Memory of the World program, which suffers from the misconception that the program is limited to developing and maintaining the various registers of iconic documentary heritage materials. The Memory of the World registers are not an end in themselves, but rather a means by which the objectives of the program, namely promoting awareness, appreciation, preservation and use of documentary heritage, may be pursued. So 2 years ago we formed the view that the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee was the most logical sponsor for such an initiative, noting that there's no national peak body that spans the different sectors and professions that are involved in these endeavours. Years ago, we had, some of you would remember, we used to have the Collections Council of Australia, but sadly that entity no longer exists. So in the absence of such a peak body, the Memory of the World Committee is our best bet for engineering cross-sectoral coordination and collaboration. So what have we done since 2018? Following the summit, a small group of summit organisers and delegates, together with some Memory of the World Committee members, have been active in discussing the initiative with a range of interested organisations and academic researchers. Initially, we decided that our most pressing need was to get some rigorous research happening to give us a more informed understanding of the current state of documentary heritage preservation in Australia. This research, we felt, should explore potential evidence sources and frameworks for identifying gaps in holdings and ways of prioritising the documentation of important but neglected and underrepresented aspects of life in Australia. We felt that we needed a solid evidence base to inform the planning and coordination of efforts, and that research, in addition to inclusive community participation and consultation, is needed to build and test this evidence base. We've had many useful and detailed discussions with a wide variety of academics across Australia from a variety of disciplines. All expressed interest in and support for the initiative, and many very good ideas and suggestions have been forthcoming. These discussions are continuing. Sadly, however, they've not yet borne fruit in any viable research funding proposal to the Australian Research Council. I suspect that the current climate is not a good one for holding these kinds of discussions. Australian universities are doing it tough right now, and available resources and energies are stretched, but we will keep trying. But ARC-funded research is not the only means by which research may be conducted. Following the summit, our discussions with Marie-Louise Ayres at the National Library led to a decision by the library's peak body, NASLA, National and State Libraries of Australasia, to initiate a research project aimed at developing a snapshot of the current state of manuscript collections in Australia's national and state libraries. This is a great example of a particular sector taking coordinated responsibility to develop a better evidence base of the current state of an important component of Australia's documentary heritage estate. At the suggestion of our Memory of the World Committee member, Rachel Watson, who's here this morning, earlier this year we agreed to broaden the focus of the initiative to place more emphasis on fostering grassroots, community-led documentation efforts. Rachel proposed a self-selecting communities of practice model, a bottom-up approach to documenting society that could complement and enrich the more top-down, planned and coordinated approaches pursued by peak bodies and national documentation frameworks. In a few minutes you'll hear from Jenny Fewster from AusStage about an excellent example of a community of practice that is documenting the performing arts in Australia. This case study is a great model for our planned engagement with grassroots practitioners, including community heritage grants recipients and others. Last month there occurred an important milestone in the initiative when we convened the first meeting of a steering committee that will guide the initiative into the future and which will report to the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. The steering committee, whose initial focus is on pursuing the action items from the Canberra Declaration, consists of members of the parent committee in addition to representatives from the Australian Society of Archivists and key national collecting institutions named in the Canberra Declaration. In future we hope to broaden the membership of the steering committee by including a representative from Glam Peak and individuals who can represent perspectives of Indigenous Australians, grassroots community heritage practitioners and users. It is intended that the steering committee will meet 3 times a year. One feature of the 2018 summit was that it included keynote speakers from Canada and New Zealand, both countries that have been active in pursuing coordinated approaches to improving distributed documentary heritage preservation and access. Our New Zealand speaker, Mark Crookston, from the National Library of New Zealand, keeps us regularly informed of developments from across the ditch. There is in New Zealand explicit acknowledgement that they have a thing called a National Documentary Heritage System. The National Library, the Archives New Zealand, Te Papa and the Film and Sound Archive work together to exercise leadership and provide support for this system and its associated Preserving the Nation's Memory work program, which is now called Tahuhu. Senior positions have been created in these institutions with responsibility for liaison, coordination and strategic relationship management that the program includes. And the relevant New Zealand Government Minister requires all budget bids now to demonstrate how they will impact on and relate to the documentary heritage system. And this morning I got a hot off the press update from Mark Crookston, who emailed this through to me. He's now the Program Director of Documentary Heritage at the National Library of New Zealand. He says, it was important for New Zealand to be in Canberra for the Documenting Australian Society Summit in 2018. The context of the challenges around bringing parts of our respective documentary heritage systems were similar enough for the Canberra Declaration to be of interest here. At the same time, system leaders from central agencies in New Zealand had come together to discuss their respective mandates for leadership and coordination relating to documentary heritage. Throughout 2019 and 2020, leaders from those central agencies regularly met to discuss the opportunities to collaborate to build a sustainable documentary heritage system, taking advantage of digital opportunities and supporting respective strategic directions. In October 2020, the National Library of New Zealand created a new director position, Program Director Documentary Heritage, to start to give some focus to the need for strengthened central leadership for documentary heritage and other priorities. Professional discussions with colleagues across New Zealand on areas of common challenge and interest relating to documentary heritage started just last week, and I look forward to sharing progress with our Australian colleagues as we start to progress the development of a framework for collaboration and identifying priority areas. So, recently Laura Tingle published a quarterly essay on what Australia can learn from New Zealand. I would add to her list that we should be inspired by just how seriously New Zealand is tackling the coordination efforts across their nation to build a more representative and coordinated documentary heritage estate. Here in Australia, our steering committee has agreed that we need to test our thinking and assumptions with interested parties and key players around the nation, including engaging with grassroots recipients of community heritage grants over the past 25 years. To that end, we have decided to draft a discussion paper on the concept of a distributed Australian documentary heritage estate for broad circulation, comment and feedback. It will not surprise anyone listening today when I say that governments in this country, perhaps in contrast to New Zealand, have in recent years not exactly given high priority to cultural policies of any kind, much less policies and strategies specifically focused on documentary heritage. Nevertheless, we can but hope that eventually the wheel may turn and that governments might once again demonstrate a real interest in our concerns and issues. In the meantime, we need to be able to demonstrate that we are doing the best we can collectively to get our house in order. The UNESCO Memory of the World Committee will continue to strive to engage with appropriate parts of government to keep them informed of our efforts, not with a begging bowl, but rather as a collective of professionals and practitioners who are capable of and committed to deploying limited public funding in the best possible way to ensure the creation and maintenance of a truly inclusive and representative documentary heritage national estate. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to today's discussions and Q&As. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian, for that very, very valuable context to today's event. And now I'd like to introduce, coming to us from South Australia virtually, Jenny Fewster, who is the project manager of AusStage, the Australian National Online Resource for Live Performance Research. Jenny was appointed project manager in 2003 of AusStage and is currently deputy chair of the Performing Arts Heritage Network of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association. And AusStage provides us with a wonderful case study of one of those communities of practice that's grown up around a particular activity, in this case performing arts and its documentation. So over to Jenny's presentation. Thank you.
The community responsible for producing, collecting, preserving and researching the performing arts in Australia has become a model for best practice, both in Australia and internationally. The performing arts is a highly ephemeral art form, sometimes with no material trace of its happening after the event. This creates challenges for the accurate recording of the art form for posterity, challenges which have been largely overcome by a strong community working together for the greater good. Performing arts practice is a highly collaborative endeavour, and this is reflected in the community of practice dedicated to documenting it for future generations. There are three pivotal stakeholders in the performing arts community of practice in Australia. Two professional bodies. First, the Australasian Association for Theatre, Drama and Performance Studies, or ADSA, represents the theatre, drama and performance studies scholars. The Performing Arts Heritage Network, PAN, of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, AMAGA, represents the performing arts collections custodians. AusStage, the research and resource discovery platform for Australian live performance, represents the interests of both of these bodies, as well as industry and government, providing a useful focal point for the community. ADSA, the peak academic association promoting the study of drama in any performing medium throughout Australasia, represents staff and postgraduate students of Australasian institutions of tertiary education who are engaged in teaching, research and practice in theatre, drama and performance studies. Directors of associated theatres and members of the theatrical profession are also active members. ADSA's annual conference is held once a year and attracts delegates from universities, industry, government and collections. PAN is a small yet vibrant national network whose members come together in the interests of collecting, preserving and making accessible Australia's performing arts heritage. Records documenting this rich heritage are found throughout dispersed collections, residing in museums, galleries and libraries, both urban and rural. PAN holds annual conferences that have sought to highlight these dispersed collections, and by emphasising regional and place-specific performing arts heritage, to make connections between collections, research, industry and practitioners. AusStage is the discipline's research and discovery platform, a sophisticated research tool which documents performing arts productions with integrated associations to data about physical resources. AusStage performs a curatorial function, accumulating a virtual collection of items that are otherwise dispersed in actual collections nationally and internationally. By streamlining discovery in this way, AusStage enables researchers to more easily engage with the rich history and heritage of Australian performing arts and artists at home and abroad. As a result, AusStage provides improved opportunities for research and education and increased visibility for libraries, museums, archives and documentation centres of the performing arts. AusStage's methodological innovations and data standards were acknowledged in a recent review of digital resources in Theatre Journal, the discipline's leading periodical. In it, AusStage is described as one of the most sophisticated and promising efforts to develop a digital database for theatre and performance research, with broad application for reshaping the way we think about preserving, examining and cataloguing performance ephemera. The symbiotic intersection between ADSA, PAN and AusStage has facilitated relationship building amongst the community. Members of PAN provide AusStage with the source material to create thin data records detailing event information such as place and time, cast and creatives. In turn, AusStage provides PAN members with increased public exposure by recording information about holdings in their collections. Members of ADSA use AusStage to give scholarly interpretation to the data and PAN holdings in research papers, journal articles, books and other research outputs. The organisations also have formalised relationships. The chair of PAN has been a partner on every AusStage funding application and holds a position on the Advisory Council. Likewise, ADSA has been represented on each funding application, with the chair of the executive holding a position on the Advisory Council. Reciprocally, the project manager of AusStage has been a member of PAN since 2002 and has held a position on the committee since 2008. The AusStage manager also holds a position on the ADSA Executive Committee. ADSA, PAN and AusStage facilitate, promote and nurture relationships between stakeholders, forming a coherent, cooperative and collaborative community. The focus on Australian performance histories provides a common passion for professionals from research, collections and industry to explore synergies and opportunities for future collaboration. Many of the members of the community have a background in performance practice, so collaborative practice and working towards collective learning are traits that are well ingrained and heartily embraced. There is a tacit understanding that by working together, there will be outcomes for the common good in the documentation of performing arts in Australia. Furthermore, the organisations themselves are driven by the needs of their users. Their governance is derived from their membership base, providing a ground-up approach to leadership. This model of self-governance gives a sense of ownership, which creates identity, trust, value and connection. Practitioners in the community view each other as peers and place value on their shared identity in relation to the performing arts. This ensures that practitioners perceive a high return on the time they invest in participating in the community. Sadly, COVID-19 has affected all aspects of our society, and the performing arts community has been particularly hard hit. Already reeling from brutal arts funding cuts, practitioners and companies have been unable to proceed with planned seasons and performances. During 2020, they've embraced online performance, sometimes for no recompense, as a way to keep their art and their relationship with their audiences alive. Similarly, our PAN members, who are tasked with preserving the material traces of the performing arts in Australia, have been in a state of flux, closed to the public and researchers for prolonged periods, with many staff working from home and essential staff only on site. At the same time, the new performance paradigm has created challenges around how these collections can adequately collect the plethora of born digital material that COVID-19 has triggered in the performing arts community. Performance studies academic community, already hit hard by the reduced numbers of international students in the Australian tertiary sector due to COVID-19, took a second blow when the bill increasing humanities student fees by up to 113% passed Parliament in October. Already 4 performance studies units, 1 in New South Wales, 2 in Victoria, and 1 in Western Australia, are in the process of being disbanded. Likewise, research funding in the sector is diminishing. To track the effects of COVID-19 on the performing arts in Australia, we've added the ability to trace cancelled, postponed, and rescheduled productions to the AusStage database. We've also begun recording information about streamed performances. The addition of this data to AusStage will enable us to look back and examine with some accuracy what effect the pandemic has had on our lucrative performing arts industry. History tells us that the performing arts community is both caring and resilient. It has survived major setbacks such as past pandemics, wars, the advent of the talkie, as well as previous shifts in commercialisation and arts funding. History also tells us that the performing arts community, largely due to the very nature of its creativity, is agile and extraordinarily adept at change. COVID-19 has forced us to do things differently, a challenge that has been met head on, and one that has resulted in new markets and methodologies for our community of practice. The ephemeral nature of live performance is a contributing factor to the success of the community, not the impediment some might think it to be. Work in performing arts heritage is often about rendering tacit knowledge explicit, making tangible the intangible, and capturing, validating, and documenting that which may otherwise be forgotten. Our community members are storytellers whose stories are about the practice of storytelling. Together, AusStage, ADSA and PAN provide a supportive platform for these stories to be rehearsed, shared and retold. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day in Canberra. Bye for now.
Well, thank you to Jenny for that very, very interesting exposition of how this community of practice operates. And I recommend you look at the AusStage database if you have a chance. It's really very impressive indeed. Now we're having a short break, observing COVID-19 restrictions, of course. Tea and coffee service at the back of the room. We'll be resuming in 5 or 6 minutes, if possible. So thank you very much.